In the late 19th century, there was a whole group of people who worked in the East End of London, and they were dockers, and many of them slept in the streets. And when winter came along and there were less ships to empty, they would then go and work in the gasworks at Beckton. Those were the good old days when we needed the poor. The poor were very important. And one of the arguments that I never hear is how essential poverty is to the continuation of society and how essential poverty is to keep capitalism going. For instance, if Mr. Steve Jobs wanted to pop round the corner around Seattle or Palo Alto and get some local guys to produce an iPad, then you and I would be buying an iPad for $10,000 or $15,000. So what Mr. Jobs does is he goes further and further and further and further and further away from the marketplace and gets the poor to do the job so you can have it for $400 or $500 or £400 or £500. So let's not forget that poverty is a really essential ingredient in the society and in the economic system that we live in. And if we did not have poor people, then we would have real problems in fulfilling our everyday needs, whether it's pulling the chain or whether it is using a computer or using our mobile phone. I don't know what's going to happen when the Chinese workers wake up to the fact that they actually should not get the equivalent of about 2 days' pay for what is earned in Europe and in America. And that will come, and then we're going to have a real crisis because we'll have run out of poor people to exploit. Now, the interesting thing about the United Kingdom, and to some extent the United States, is that in the 1980s, we lost interest, or should we say we lost the need of the working classes, or a large section of them. In the 1890s, 100 years before, we needed them. We needed them to unload our ships. We needed them to go to the colonies and work their knackers off so that we could have our streets lined and paved and lighted. We needed the working classes and we needed the poor. But come when Margaret Thatcher in the mid-1985 decided that she would pull the plug on the lame duck industries, on the government-sponsored industries, then when Mr. Willie Whitelaw, or Lord Willie Whitelaw, said to him, Madam, what are we going to do with nearly 800,000 people? And she said, imitating Marie Antoinette, who said, let them eat cake, she said, let them have benefit. And that is the beginning of the end of the crisis that we are still, the beginning of the crisis that we are still in. Since that period of time, we have destroyed the welfare state and turned it into a place where we park up millions of people. We warehouse the poor and we park them over there and we say, you stay over there for a while, we'll never really need you again. And actually, we can pass it on to your children and pass it on to your children's children. All right with that? Right, my voice is going. It's because I shout too much. I was very fortunate in not being born into the working classes when they parked them up, though some of my younger members of my family who were born into the working classes where they have not had to work for 25 years because they were depressed. Depression is better than working, by the way. It means you can drink all day. And every time you put a pint to your lip, it is a government-sponsored pint. Isn't that wonderful? And every time you go to the betting shop and you put your money in and you know who's paying it for it, not you. And that, unfortunately, is what's happened to members of my family. I was very fortunate. I was born in 1946, just after the Second World War. And even though we were homeless at a very, very early age and lived in the slums of Notting Hill, every time I got into trouble with the police, which started when I was about 10, I got banged up from about the age of 13, 14, 15, on and on into my 20s. Every time I got nicked, I was taught something. So I learnt to read and write in Ashford Boys Prison. So that's why I'm the posh git that you see now. And that's why I've got an MBE. No, I got it for something else. So what was interesting is that there used to be a system in the good old days when we needed the working class and we needed to reform them when they erred. There was a system where you went in bad and you came out relatively good. They closed down the detention centre that I was in to do my short, sharp shock. They closed it down. Why did they close it down? They closed it down because it had 40% recidivism rate. That means 4 in 10 people got into trouble again within a period of 3 years. Wow! We have prisons where you have 98, 100% recidivism rates. So something's going wrong. Something has really gone wrong. In my opinion, I disagree with the gentleman, Mark. I disagree with Mark when he says that poverty is put right down the bottom. I tell you what I think. I really think we've got poverty wrong. We actually spend too much time and too much money on the poor. And what we do is we enslave them. We park them up. We don't give them the opportunity. We postpone the day when they can get together and have some social mobility. They are of another species. When the people who run the poverty industry, when the people who run the government, when the MPs talk, they're talking about the poor as another species. They're dogs or they're cats, but they're certainly not one of us. What I try to do in the big issue is take an example from my own life. I used to be a part of the problem, and I became a part of the solution. I used to be from poverty and from the poor, and I got out by using the prison system and becoming socially mobile. But if you could ever look at the record of the homeless organizations, of the charities, of the people like Ed Miliband, who when I stopped him in the street and said to him, why don't you think social mobility is important? He says, well, you know, we've got to help people and all that. I said, bollocks. Excuse my French. It's crap. Your dad and mum came into this country as a pair of Jewish refugees with nothing. And now you own property and all that because your family could use the opportunities and you could become socially mobile. I'm trying to rush. I normally do this in about 3 hours. But the other thing is, what we've got a real problem. And the real problem is the government today is the greatest means of manufacturing poverty. It is the greatest machine for creating crime. It is the real reality. We use the benefit system, we park people up, we don't really care about them, or we have not cared about them. All we do is have a sentimental attachment to them, and what we really should be doing, when people like Ed Miliband talk, they should be saying, what I'm going to do when I get into government is put social mobility right at the top. In 2004, the Roundtree Trust, which had been measuring poverty for nearly 100 years, on their centennial report, what did they say? They said that in spite of all the money that had gone into by Mr. Blair, that we'd only scratched the surface of poverty. I say, really, what we've done is we have continued to enslave the poor, to use the poor, and not to give them the opportunity of getting out. I agree that what we've got to do in those first 5 years is give the poor a Rolls-Royce service. Because if you give the poor a Rolls-Royce service in those first 5 years, what it means is you're not then spending millions of them, millions and millions of pounds on them throughout their lifetime. Last thing, I went to see Mr. David Cameron just after he became leader of the party. And I said to Mr. Cameron, why is it that somebody like you probably cost about £500,000 to produce? And he said, well, actually, it was about $250,000. So all those silly green jackets and those uphill, four-wheel drives and the skiing holidays and all that and the piano lessons and the Bullingdon Club, all that only cost £250,000. I said, you know what? We have just done a survey. We've just done a survey of 100 big issue vendors, and 80% of them had been in local authority care. And you know what? On average, they'd been there 10 years at £2,000 or £3,000 a week. You're talking about over £1 million. And I said to Mr. Cameron, you're dead cheap. You are dead cheap. We could produce 4 David Camerons for one big issue vendor. We have the most expensive poor in the world. And there's a terrible conspiracy against the poor because the well-intended, the people, the social engineers and all those people are keeping the poor enslaved with all their emphasis on all their need to, in a sense, identify with the poor. I think what we've got to do is reinvent government, and we've certainly got to reinvent the voluntary sector. When I started the big issue 20 years ago, am I running over? No.
One minute.
Yeah. When I started the big issue 20 years ago, there were 501 homeless organisations in London alone. Not one of those gave homeless people the chance of making their own money. Why? Because they'd spend it badly. That was the argument. So they gave you bread, they gave you milk, they gave you some place to sleep, they gave you all sorts of stuff. But what they didn't give you was the means of your own social transformation. And when I look at my staff, I say, do you know what I want? I'm looking forward to the day when my staff can become, when my vendors can become middle class like you. And the whole system is against the poor joining the middle class because they feel that the middle class, the poor are some kind of other species. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much indeed, John. I think you've blown the room away there. Let me just ask you one thing, because you didn't really pick up on what I thought you might talk about was the big society. I mean, are you an enthusiast for David Cameron's big society?
I'm not an enthusiast for any political party that wants to use something which we have been fighting for so long. But if Mr. Cameron, because I'm a provider, I mean, I have to provide for the poor, so I have to get up in the morning and I have to look in the mirror and say, yeah, I'm doing all right for the poor. So I have to talk to the devil. And if Mr. David Cameron says he's going to put fire and brimstone in the system so that we can deliver to the poor, so that we can have a society which is not all about the government, because the worst thing you can do, you get a fat government, and what you do is you get more poverty, you get people caught in poverty. I'm a great believer in us. You and I'm a participatory Democrat. I'm not a representational Democrat. Okay. I believe that all of you have got to get off your arse and determine the way that society works. So I'm a big society guy, and I want you to be big society girls and big society boys. And we've got to say, okay, David, show us how to do it. And I have offered David Cameron, I don't know if he's going to take it. I said, all right, then, you can guest edit the big issue. And you write down, you put pounds, shillings and pence. You put meat on the bone rather than presenting all the arguments as though all we've got to do is think it up and it's going to happen. That's my big argument. Okay. Let's get to the stage where we actually have evidence that this administration and the MPs are going to start freeing us up to run our own society, because the state does a terrible service. and the local authorities are absolute crap. Okay. Look what they did over Christmas. They couldn't even take the rubbish away.